So thank you for inviting me to speak at this event. It's the first time that I've actually spoke at a specific event on housing and antisocial behaviour. So it's a first for me, but it's a real honour and a privilege. My background and primary research interests for over 40 years now has been the relationship between drugs and crime. But this has tended to focus on particular drugs and particular crimes, most notably the relationship between the use of heroin and crack cocaine and acquisitive crimes that people commit in order to acquire the funds to purchase those two drugs. But this is the first time I've thought in depth about the relationship between drugs and antisocial behaviour. Just a note about the research methods that I've always favoured over these 4 decades. I've very much taken with qualitative methods of research, particularly those methods drawn from anthropology and ethnography. I think I hope why that's relevant for today is that requires the investigator to actually get outside of offices and university classrooms and actually into the communities where people with substance use disorders and those that live around them actually live their lives. And that's always been my passions. And a quote that I like to remind myself of is when we're looking at statistics and graphs and spreadsheets and all the essential quantitative data, that we also have a mind to the human beings whose lives they represent. And we need to be able to taste the salty tears of the people whose lives are lived behind the bold statistics of epidemiology. I really like that quote. I think it kind of sums up the endeavour for me. My interest in ethnography, which is drawn from anthropology, was prompted by my own biography. So you've probably picked up already that I'm from the north, from Greater Manchester, from Bury. I was born above a paper shop, sounds like a country and western song now, above a newsagent's in an area that was predominantly working class, and a lot of the customers of the shop lived on a nearby housing estate and worked in the local paper mills and factories. The reason I mention that is I grew up in a time of full employment when you could resign one job on a Friday and start another on a Monday. That's not to say that there wasn't crime back then. Indeed, there was, and our newsagent's paper shop was burgled way back then. But something happened in the early 1980s, and we saw an influx of brown powder heroin, which made heroin available to a population of people to whom it hadn't been available before, in a form that they were prepared to smoke it, prepared to use it. So they were able to buy £5 units, £5 bags of brown powder heroin, and were able to smoke it as opposed to traditionally injecting it. So this led to a big uptake among young working class people in the north of England to smoke heroin. And sadly and tragically, many went on to become dependent, addicted in inverted commas, and develop an opioid use disorder based around heroin. And in turn, many went on to inject that drug and became at risk of contracting bloodborne viruses like hepatitis and HIV. Although thanks to harm reduction and needle and syringe programs, we managed to reduce a lot of the harm of bloodborne viruses compared to other areas that had a similar epidemiological profile as Greater Manchester. So that's where I officially came into this world of substance use disorder. In 1984, I was employed as a researcher on a project in Bradford University to look at young people and heroin in the north of England. And we adopted a methodology drawn from qualitative methods known as privileged access interviewing. basically that means getting access to people who were engaged in the phenomena that you're looking at, in this case, heroin use, and recruiting those people to tell you their stories, and then in turn for them to ask their friends to tell their stories to them. And the technique's called snowballing. So you snowball through a cohort of people. And I found it quite easy starting off that process in Greater Manchester, because basically a lot of the people who were involved, certainly around the Bury area, were people that I'd gone to school with and grown up with. So I found doing the research there quite easy. And the methodology lent itself to that kind of immersive methodology, to be immersed in a community. And I think that's why that experience is appropriate to today's topic, because we were also able during that process to speak to people who were involved in the sale of heroin as well, and most of those were selling the drug to finance their own habits. I spent 14 years with the Lifeline Drugs Treatment Charity in Manchester, and then I worked for the Home Office, Public Health England, and the NHS for some 16 years. So I've pretty much worked in every area of British drug research, policy, and practice. And I hope that qualifies me to make some of these observations. Over recent years, we've learned a lot more about people who develop substance use disorders, and particularly the role of trauma in the emergence of substance use disorders amongst people. And the way that it tends to work is that a lot of people will experience a high level of adverse childhood experiences that will produce trauma. And this trauma is the root of the poor mental health that people then go on to self-medicate. So the directionality tends to be, in most cases, a high incidence of adverse childhood experiences leading to trauma, more trauma possibly as a child and an adolescent and as a young adult, that resulting in poor mental health. And then the use, self-medication, and the use of drugs like heroin and crack cocaine, and a whole range of other drugs to self-medicate those mental health problems. In other words, probably I would say for most people, the adverse childhood experiences, the trauma and the mental health problems existed before the substance use came along, which is a form of self-medication. So if we look now at antisocial behaviour associated with substance use, the first thing I'd want to say is it appears to me that the drug that's most associated with antisocial behaviour is alcohol. And I've had the experience over the years of living next door to people who drink lots of alcohol, and also living next door to people who smoke lots of cannabis. And if I had to choose, I would rather put up with the smell of cannabis than the sound of alcohol. Living next door to people who drink a lot is, spoilt many a potential Sunday afternoon in the garden because of the noise from the neighbours as they use their preferred drug, alcohol. When it comes to the use of drugs like heroin and crack cocaine, the antisocial behaviour that's associated with that often involves litter, so drug-related paraphernalia and litter. That is a real nuisance, and obviously potentially particularly worrying in terms of discarded syringes, although there are many attempts now to clear those up using needle and syringe programs. And volunteers, which I'll say a little bit more about in a second. But the antisocial behaviour associated with heroin and crack cocaine tends to revolve around those areas or premises where drug dealing is taking place. And obviously, if drug dealing is taking place from premises or from a particular locality, it will attract people from outside that area, not just people who live in there. And that's a potential problem and obviously a concern for multi-agency work with the police. When landlords are looking for help with problematic tenants and prospective tenants, they will often look to the statutory drug and alcohol treatment agencies for support. However, over recent years, local recovery organisations are emerging and are sometimes better placed to provide this practical help and assistance. Over the 5 years of my time with Public Health England as strategic recovery lead, we learned that successful recovery from substance use disorders requires three things, basically: jobs, friends, and homes. If you like, something to do, somebody to love, and somewhere to live, somewhere to be at home. And many of the friends in people in recovery are now coming together and finding jobs and volunteering opportunities in their own organisations, which are termed LEROs, Lived Experience Recovery Organisations. And they're now organised under an umbrella body, which is the CLERO, which is the College of Lived Experience Recovery Organisations. And these organisations are growing increasingly. They grew particularly during the pandemic because when a lot of orthodox services felt it necessary to restrict their activity, the lived experience recovery organisations basically stepped into that space and carried on as normal, having in many cases to beg and borrow personal protective equipment and to carry on as normal. And it struck me that the reason why they did that is not because they were, disregarding personal health and safety, but they brought a slightly different orientation to the endeavour. And it seemed to me that they were responding to these individuals as if they were family. So if this person was my brother or my sister, how would I respond? And that seemed to me the difference. They ensured that they carried on throughout the pandemic. And another organisation that's carried on through the pandemic is the Calico Charity Group. I now live in Burnley, and Calico provides social housing and other interventions. In fact, it's worthy of note that Calico have just been successful recently in heading up a bid to provide substance use disorder treatment services in the borough of Blackburn with Darwin, which I think is indicative of the recognition of the importance of social housing. The other thing to say is that I don't think it's an accident that the lived experience recovery organisations and indeed Calico both saw unprecedented growth during the pandemic because they carried on in that kind of compassionate community, with that compassionate community orientation. In Calderdale, there's an organisation called the Lived Experience Recovery Organisation called the Basement Recovery Project. And over recent months, they've been working with a private landlord and other agencies to try and provide a solution to an area that had become really quite problematic, where many of the most marginalised people in Calderdale were congregating. It's a necessary service, obviously, but a high concentration of highly problematic people brings its own challenges. One of the striking, features of this population is that 90% of them were known to social services before they were born. Before they were born, they were known to social services, which is an indication of the intergenerational nature of substance use disorders. The involvement of the Basement Project, the Lived Experience Recovery Organisation in Calderdale, has brought a palpable sense of optimism to this situation. And there seems now to be solutions in sight that had evaded orthodox multi-agency approaches for some time. That's not to say that everything is sorted by any means. And one of the problems that's emerging almost as we speak is that the area, because of its reputation, still attracts people from outside who come to, they come to acquire and to use drugs there as they once had in the past. And so now it's a challenge now to actually protect the residents of this area. And it's worth remembering that whilst a lot of people with substance use disorders may well be the source of antisocial behaviour, they are also the victims of antisocial behaviour. And here's a classic example where the residents of a particular area are now energised and enthused by seeing people that they know who have recovered from a substance use disorder, now are seeking to achieve recovery themselves, but having that opportunity compromised by the constant appearance of people who from outside who are coming to carry on using. So I note that people can be both. People who were once perpetrators of antisocial behaviour can also be victims, and we see this sometimes when lived experience recovery organisations have established abstinence-based housing. In other words, their clients, their customers are trying to stay drug and alcohol free, and yet they're in an area where drug and alcohol use is highly problematic, and once again, they then become victims of antisocial behaviour. But it's all the overall experience of the emergence of lived experience recovery organisations is encouraging. There will be one in your area. You might not be aware of it immediately. They might not be that well advertised, but there will be an organisation in your area or very near to your area. And I'd just like to finish by saying that part of my plan work going forward is to liaise between the lived experience recovery organisations and the College of Lived Experience Recovery Organisations and people like yourselves and your colleagues, in order that you can make contact with your local nearest lived experience recovery organisation in order to find solutions to problems that you might have been struggling to solve in the past. I'm more than happy to speak to anybody. My website's under construction at the moment, but my details are connected to this via email or mobile. And I also provide training and lectures and pretty much anything to do with substance use disorders and pretty much anything to do with substance use disorders.